I happened on Shabbos to stumble across this talk of the Rebbe, meaning I can't claim I was looking for it. I wasn't. I didn't know about it, but it gave me a new insight on the concept of the Bnei Noah, and it gave me again, each time just sort of deepens your understanding, your appreciation, the significance of the Bnei Noah, and how there's that amazing dynamics between what God wants from the Bnei Noah and what God wants from the Jewish people. So I thought I would share it. This is a talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe said this talk, it's really a combination of three different talks. Two were said in maybe just about the end of 1984, and one was the end of 1982. And in those occasions, the Rebbe was discussing a certain theme, which again, he raises sort of a pretty obvious question. I learned it because I thought the question was interesting and obvious when you think about it. Like sometimes you have a question and then you learn something that's sort of echoing or strengthening the question, and you're like, hey, I'd like to go down that road and find out this information. But what I didn't know was I was going to uncover another aspect on Bnei Noah. So it gave me some insights. So I wanted to share it. So the question that the Rebbe is raising in this talk is based on the Torah portion of today, the end of the Torah portion of Sarah, where we're at. Abraham is about 140 years old, not about, precisely 140 years old. And his wife, Sarah, had passed away 3 years before. And now his son, Yitzchak, Isaac, goes and brings him another woman. Not exactly on the legal status of a wife, what Torah calls a pilegesh, but that's a separate discussion, not so relevant. The verse says her name was Keturah. We're actually told she was Hagar, the same Hagar from many, many years before, who was the mother of Ishmael. And he has with her 6 children. So the obvious question is, what's going on? He's 140 years old. When he was 100, he gave birth to Isaac. And that was a very big deal. And there's a lot of verses in Torah discussing what a big deal it was that a man at age 100, we know in those days they lived longer, but still in those days, generally, people had children when they were, let's say, 70, 60. Now they're 100. We could say, well, 70 to 100 is only 30 years, but I was thinking it'd be sort of like, let's say someone at the end of our stretching could have a child when he's 55 to 85, that's a big difference. So in those days, for a man, when he was 60 or 70, to have children was normative, not 100. And therefore, for Abraham to have Isaac at age 100 was a huge, big deal miracle. Sarah was 90, Abraham was 100, and God made this huge, huge miracle, and Isaac was born. Fast forward 40 years, and now Abraham is fathering 6 more children. And nobody says a word. It's not written in the Torah. It's not even written in any of the commentaries. The big miracle going on here. Well, isn't it an even bigger miracle? He's 40 years older. How do you suddenly have these 6 more sons? Clear question? You cannot. I can see you. Clear? Yes. Unclear, let me know. Now on Zoom, you have 3 options. You can open your mouth and talk, which means for most of you, you're gonna have to unmute yourself. That's fine. You press the little button on the bottom, you unmute and you talk. Or you can write a chat and press it, and then it pops up on the screen. And if you have a private question that you don't want the whole world knowing, you can write on the chat, and where it says to everyone, hit that and it'll come down to the options of every single person on this chat, including me. Then you hit my name, and then I see your question, but nobody else does, so I can address it without anyone knowing who it came from. So those are your 3 awesome options. So everything was clear so far? Great. Abraham's 140. When he was 100 and an Isaac, it's a big deal miracle. When Danielle's just showing us how computer savvy she is. When he's 140 and has 6 kids, nobody says a word, nobody blinks an eye. So the question is, why not? Clear question. Okay, great. So that was to me an interesting question because I had done the verses that was discussing this shortly before I opened this up. And I was, the back of my mind, I was sort of thinking about those kids and wondering. I don't think I formulated the question as precisely, but I was going somewhat in that direction. So I was like curious to know the Rebbe's answer. So a person could say, there's lots of possible answers. You could say, well, maybe the fact that he was 100 and had the kid wasn't the whole point. It wasn't because he was so old. It was just because he was sterile. Well, he wasn't sterile because he already had Ishmael. They were infertile, maybe through Sarah specifically. So maybe that was the issue. I'm 100, all right. Normally they give birth at 60, 70, 100, not such a big deal. But that doesn't seem to be the case because all the verses that are talking about how miraculous it was that he gave birth at 100 imply it was amazing that she was 90 and had a child and he was 100 and had a child, let alone the fact that they were able to have children until now. So that answer does not seem to wash. So then another answer could be, well, listen, maybe for him to have Isaac when he was 100, God gave him a rejuvenation of strength. And Sarah and Abraham both became younger to be able to have Isaac. So maybe that blessing is still existent, and that's why at 140, you can also have a kid. It's not such a big deal. But that doesn't seem to be the case because in between him having that child at 100, Isaac, and 140, the verse says he was old. It's clearly written in the verse. So maybe he became young at 100 for the miracle, but then he got old again. So now at 140, guess what? He's old. And yet he had these 6 kids. So what's going on? So our question is still our question. So basically the answer, to understand the answer, the Rebbe says here that when Isaac was born, we see that it's not just that Sarah and Abraham had this child, or they have their own baby that's so nice, Isaac, hi Dixie, or even to understand it on a more cosmic level, Abraham and Sarah are now beginning the Jewish nation. Now there's a continuation. If we want to view on a certain level Abraham as the first Jew, where he often is viewed that way, if Abraham and Sarah are the first Jews, well, now they have a child, there's a continuation, there's going to be a Jewish people. So this baby is very significant. He is. That's Isaac. But we see that at his birth, more was going on than that. How do we see that? Because when he was born, Sarah's blessing, we're told, spread to the world. And the verses and the Midrash says clearly that just as Sarah, who was barren for all these 90 years, when God opened up her womb, when God gave her the blessing of children, it says that many barren women in the world were remembered with her blessing. So there were lots and lots of women in the world that didn't have, IVF and all such things in those days. Lots of barren women who just were despaired of ever having the blessing of children. Suddenly they also became pregnant and had healthy children on the coattails of Sarah's blessing. So that's the Midrash. It's known. It says when Isaac was born, it was a day of joy for the world, because not only was he born, but many, many, many other barren people were remembered at that point. So what we see is, now that's known, and many, people might know that Midrash, but when they're not really thinking of the implication of it. And the Rebbe says there's a big implication to that Midrash. And this is the Rebbe's understanding of it. The Rebbe says the implication is that the blessing for Isaac, which is a blessing for the Jewish people, wasn't limited to the Jewish people. There was an extension here that this blessing had to affect the world. It's very interesting, and the Rebbe points out something that I never thought about, so maybe nobody else ever thought about, but very interesting about what happened when Isaac was born. Before Isaac was born, his parents' names were changed a year before. Until then, until 89, her name was Sarai. A year prior, when God is giving them the blessing that they're going to have a child in a year, God changes her name from Sarai to Sarah. And Abraham, for his first 99 years of life, was called Abram. And then, with the blessing for the birth of Isaac, his name is changed from Abram to Abraham. From, in the Hebrew, Avram to Avraham. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And God explains the reason for the name change. Sarai means my princess. Sarah means the princess, like everyone's princess, everyone's queen. Abram means father of Aram, one nation. Abraham means father of the nations. So God is doing something very interesting that nobody really seems to think about, but really almost weird. Abraham and Sarah are going to have the child that's going to create the Jewish nation, right? Abraham and Sarah, to Isaac with Rebekah, to Jacob with his 4 wives, with their 12 tribes, to ultimately the millions of Jews that leave Egypt and receive the Torah and become the Jewish nation. So this concept of Abraham and Sarah having a child is to father the Jewish nation. But God, in changing their name to change their mazal, which means in a sense their spiritual energy, to make them capable of having this child, changes the implication of their names from like sort of personal and private to the world. It's not my princess, it's the princess of the world. It's not father of one nation, it's father of all the nations. So that's sort of like strange. Like, what's going on here? We're fathering the Jewish people. Why are their names implying like a global cosmic identity here, parenting the world? So the Rebbe says that's something that was going on now. So when Abraham and Sarah are able now to have Isaac, we also see, based on their names, that they're really impacting in a way they couldn't before the peoples of the world. And we see this impact on the peoples of the world in Sarah at the time of Isaac's birth. We see it that the blessing God gave Sarah impacted peoples of the world. And that's why all of these barren women were able to have children. And also another thing Sarah did that we've mentioned on this class more than once, I mentioned it recently, like 2 times ago, is that when he was weaned, or at some party they made for Isaac, God set up a situation that all these honorable women came to the party without their nursemaids. Oh my gosh, the child's hungry. Wait, well, there's no isomel, and there's no nursemaid, and we obviously can't nurse because we never nurse. We're too, important for that. We have a nursemaid. Who can nurse this child of mine that's screaming? Wait, all the kids are screaming. Wait, who can nurse all the kids? Sarah says, oh, I can. And Sarah nursed all the children. And on the surface, the reason given for that is because the people were saying, oh, come on, you think Abraham and Sarah at 190 finally had a kid? I mean, for all these years they couldn't, and suddenly at such old age, when nobody's having children anymore, they produced a child. They picked up a stray baby somewhere and they're pretending it's their child. So to prove to the world that this is truly their child, God made this situation that Sarah nursed all these babies so everyone knows she's really the mom. She's really able to nurse. So this is really her kid. And that's a famous concept that we've discussed before. The Rebbe says, wait a minute. If that was all the reason this was done for, if the reason for this situation was because we want to validate Isaac is truly Abraham's child, first of all, God did something else to validate that, because it says that the face of Isaac was a carbon copy of Abraham's. So everyone knew it was his kid. And if we really wanted to make sure Sarah was involved and it wasn't another woman or something, they could have just seen her nursing. He could have been hungry and cried, and she could have gone and nursed him, and they could have said, oh wow, she's the real mom, she's nursing. Or maybe one child there would need a nursemaid, and Sarah could have volunteered. And oh wow, she's the real mom. She can nurse at age 90. Amazing. Look at the wonders of God. So if it was only to prove that Sarah's the real mom, we didn't need her to nurse all those children. But the Midrash says she nursed all the babies. They all brought their babies, and they all forgot their nursemaids, and all the babies are crying, and Sarah nursed all the babies. Which means, again, Sarah's impacting all these leaders of the world. All these children of the leaders of the world are being nursed by Sarah's milk. I remember I told you this. The Rebbe doesn't go into this point in this talk. Remember I told you how it's explained that every one of you, every righteous Gentile, is descendant of a child that got Sarah's milk. Because Sarah's milk went into their system, and something in their system now became open to godliness in a very different way. Made them sensitive to God in a different way. Because they had nursed from Sarah. They had Sarah inside of her. So what we're seeing is, with the birth of Isaac, Sarah's changing people in the world. Sarah's causing, through her blessing, many other women to have children. And Sarah's changing the nature of many babies in the world. Because many babies at that time, all of the honorable, important people of the time that were invited to this honorable, important party, all the elite of the world at that time, all those babies drank from Sarah's milk. So why did this happen? Because Sarah's supposed to impact the world. And that's what she did then when Isaac was born. 40 years later, Abraham's now impacting the world. How is he impacting the world? Because these 6 children, these new 6 children that he has at age 140, are all going to become the fathers of nations, some of them of a nation and some of them of various nations, as is enumerated in the text, in the Bible, in the Torah. So suddenly there's all these new peoples in the world that were fathered by Abraham, that have Abraham's energy in them. And I felt like, wow, like this is what I was thinking actually when I was doing the Torah portion. I was actually thinking about this concept, like, look at these nations. These are nations of the peoples of the world, and yet their father is Abraham. And their mother was Hagar. She was a very righteous woman. So these two, I mean, obviously Abraham was incredibly godly, but Hagar was a very righteous person. And that's the mother of Ishmael, the parents, Abraham and Sarah, the parents of Ishmael, and the parents of these 6 other nations that are now populating the world. I was actually wondering, in your brain you start just wondering random things. So I was thinking to myself when I was reading the Torah portion before I learned this talk, I was thinking like, I mean, Abraham passes away when he's 175. I mean, seemingly Hagar was much younger. So if she was still alive, I wonder what she did at that time. It's just my thoughts. You don't have to take note of this. But I was thinking, like, did she stay with Isaac because she was a religious, godly person, and obviously that would be the most religious place to be? Or maybe she'd want to go to her own child. Did she go to Ishmael, who we know had returned to God? So he was closer to God than probably any of the other children. But then here she's a mother of all these children, and they're all like gone. Did she, like, I was just wondering what happened to her and to her children afterwards, because these were her children. But she was so righteous, and they became from the peoples of the world. So what the Rebbe is saying here is that was all part of the cosmic plan. In other words, seeing how Sarah, who used to be Sarai, my princess, and now became for the world, and Abraham, who used to be Abram, just the father of one nation, Rum, and now became Abraham, the father of these many nations, they're in a position where they're supposed to be helping and impacting and changing the world. Sarah through the blessings and the nursing, and Abraham through literally fathering all these nations that are not Jewish nations, that are nations of the world. Any questions up to this point? Okay, so let me use this. I'm not going through all these points here. So to understand this, the Rebbe says, really, we have to understand that this all relates to the idea of a Noahide. That we know, of course, we know this, what Maimonides says, how there's an obligation for every human being in the world to recognize God, and for every human being in the world to serve God. And every human being serves God through the 7 laws, which of course that's a misnomer. It's not 7 specific laws, it's 7 categories of laws. Each one, of course, we know has many, many, many sub-laws. Through adhering to those 7 bodies of law, because that's what God wants, and you're listening to God, that's a Noahide. And the Rebbe now says exactly what we discussed, not last week, I think 2 weeks ago in Maimonides. The Rebbe quotes it and we discussed it, how Maimonides differentiates that there's 2 types of Noahides. I assume everyone that was on the class remembers, because it was to me a very strong, intense concept. There's a Noahide who's a Noahide by coercion. And there's a Noahide who's a Noahide with his own volition. The Noahide by coercion, coercion doesn't mean someone stuck a gun to his head. You must serve God and keep the Noahide laws. But the Noahide by coercion, we said, was a Noahide, the classical concept, as Maimonides explains it, would be a non-Jew who wants to live in Israel at the time when Israel is ruled by the Torah authority, by God's authority. And for that non-Jew to live in Israel, he has to agree to keep the Noahide laws. And if he lives in Israel and doesn't keep the Noahide laws, he's killed. So that's a Noahide by coercion. If he was living in Japan or in Tasmania or in Chicago, he wouldn't be keeping these laws. But hey, I want to live in Israel. That's my triptych. That's the only way I can live in Israel. No problem. I want to live in Israel and I want to live. So I accept God and I accept the Noahide laws and I'm going to religiously keep them because I know that if I don't, I'm going to get in very big trouble. That's a Noahide. He's keeping the Noahide laws. But it's a Noahide by coercion. A Noahide by volition, like everyone on this group, and all Noahides in the world today, and all Noahides that's been in the world for the past over 1900 years, there's no coercion. There's non-Jews that live in Israel today have no coercion to keep the laws, and no, let alone in Chicago or anywhere else in the world. Why are the Noahides keeping the Noahide laws for the past over 2,000 years? Because they have a sensitivity to God, because they believe in God, because they want to serve Him, because they want to connect to Him. That's someone who's freely on their own choosing to connect to God. And if you remember, Maimonides said, I'm sure you remember, because it's I thought a very relevant point for all of us here, that those people aren't just Noahides. They have another title. They're called Chasidei Umos Ha'olam, which means the righteous of the nations of the world. God's saying, you're my righteous people. You're choosing me freely. And as we spoke 2 weeks ago, unlike the Noahides from coercion, the Ger Toshav concept, the one that live in Israel and therefore keep the laws, but the Noahides, because they're choosing to come close to God, have a portion in the world to come. We're told that they have Olam Haba, they have the spiritual afterlife by virtue of the commandments they're keeping, because all of those commandments are truly, truly part of their relationship to God. And the energy of the commandments connects to their soul and gives them this portion in Olam Haba. So the Rebbe now touches on this idea that we understand, if we fast forward, we're talking about Abraham and Sara. Okay? 7 generations later, the Jews got the Torah. 7 generations later, we have Abraham and Sarah, then we have Isaac and Rebekah, then we have Jacob and his 4 wives, and then we can follow the line going to Egypt. We can follow one of the sons of Jacob was Levi. Levi had a son. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. One of the 12 sons of Jacob was Levi. Levi's oldest son was Kahas. Kahas' oldest child was Amram, and Amram's child, not the oldest, the youngest, is Moshe. So 7 generations later, just counted out the generations for you. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kahas, Amram, Moses, the Jews get the Torah. When the Jews get the Torah, which is when they become God's chosen people in the year 2448, about 2,500 years after creation, God tells them, you are responsible for the nations of the world. You have a mission to bring everyone close to God. You have a mission to connect every single human being to me, because every single human being is one of my children, because every single human being is supposed to serve me. So that's what 7 generations later the Jewish people are told. But now, when Abraham and Sarah are starting the journey of the Jewish people, they're also starting the journey of impacting the peoples of the world. Meaning the Rebbe is saying this is an interconnected journey, as of course it is. This is the journey of man. So we think of Abraham and Sarah giving birth to Isaac and starting the journey of the Jewish people. But we see how God views it is that Abraham becomes Abraham and Sarai becomes Sarah, and all these other women have children, and all these babies have Sarah's milk, and Abraham has 6 other children that father all these nations, because Abraham and Sarah's energy at this moment when they're able to conceive Isaac is now an energy that has to go outward and extend to embrace mankind. Because God wants everyone to be serving him. So God's putting in Abraham and Sarah's lap not just the responsibility to take this child, Isaac, this little miracle baby that God gave them, and raise him to be worthy to be the father of the Jewish people. God's saying, Abraham and Sarah, now you have the spiritual energy to really impact the peoples of the world. And of course, they've been doing that their whole lives, as we are told, happened for all these years and years and years. What were they doing for the past, however many years together? They were talking to man and speaking to them. If you know or don't know, maybe we've mentioned it, how Abraham specifically went to the desert, planted this orchard of beautiful trees, built this inn to give the wayfarers food and bring them to bless and recognize God. They worked on, as we're told, converting the people. Obviously, converting doesn't mean in a religious, official sense. There was nobody Jewish then at all, so they weren't converting them to Jews. Converting meant bringing them to a recognition of God. It says that Sarah would convert the woman and Abraham would convert the men, meaning they spoke to them about God. They spoke to them to reject paganism, to reject idolatry, to accept there's a God and accept that God wants you to serve him. So they dedicated their whole lives to bringing the world to recognize God. But now, with the birth of Isaac, suddenly it's going up a big notch. Suddenly their whole names are changing. Their whole identity is changing. Their whole ability and responsibility is changing. Because if we're going to have an Isaac on the scene, if we're going to have a Jewish people on the scene, we also need a world that's connecting to God. So as we have the birth of Isaac, as we have the Jewish people, like interwoven in that is the far greater ability of Abraham and Sarah to bless and change and impact the world. Now, of course, they're doing it in different ways, because Sarah's sort of doing it almost like indirectly. She's bringing blessings to the world. She's nursing the world. And Abraham is producing nations, right? He's giving birth to children that becomes the fathers of nations of the world. So they're doing it in different ways, but both of them are much more than before able to impact the world. Because if you're going to bring a Jewish child in the world, if you're going to bring the Jews in the world, guess what the Jew's responsibility is? Guess what is interwoven in the identity of the Jew is this identity of the world as a place where God wants to be recognized, where God wants people to serve him. Now, if we see here in Maimonides' explanation, there are 2 levels, of course, of Noachides, as we just repeated and understood and knew from before. We all knew that. This is important to us. We know this information. For other people, this will be ob-truth Maimonides. For us, we know this. It's relevant Maimonides. The people that are serving God through force, again, force does not have to necessarily, doesn't mean a gun, but some force, some coercion, some direct push, and the people that are serving God from their own volition, right? Those are 2 different levels in Noachides. So the Rebbe says that parallels the two different ways Abraham and Sarah impacted the people. Because again, this is like the antecedents. So from these antecedents, it has to spread and impact into the people. So Abraham's approach was more like the direct, if you will, if you want to call it coercion, the direct frontal approach. He fathered children that became the nations of the world. So his energy, Abraham, is now interwoven in all of these nations. He's parented them. That's like the direct approach of like bringing the people, forcing however you can to get these people to serve God. And Sarah's approach was the antecedent of the more creating the sensitivity that someone's going to choose it on their own. Makes sense, it was the woman. So Sarah's giving her energy, her milk of kindness, of love of God to the people, to the children, so they become sensitized to want to choose God. Sarah's blessing, the blessing for children, extends forth, and many other barren women have children. So it's like the blessings are coming and extending and sort of embracing the people in a way that they on their own can be like, whoa, how is it that all these years I couldn't have a child? I'm barren. No fertility treatments. That's it. We're done. So sad. And now suddenly I'm able to have a child. And my friend, we're friends because we're both barren, she also is able to have a child. And we know that Sarah is having a child. And this other barren woman, this other barren woman. And like suddenly you're putting the pieces together saying, wait, there is a God out there. There's a God that's remembering us. A God that remembers me is a God I want to serve. Is a God I want to connect to. It's a God of kindness. It's a God of love. So it's more creating the backdrop that people are being sensitized and then decide to turn to God. This parallels what we see at in Maimonides. In the last 2 chapters of Maimonides, this is exactly what we're learning. We can pull out our Maimonides because that's what we're officially learning now. So I'm teaching you from this book. This book. There's this book also where we're officially learning. And at the end, we're not up to where Maimonides discusses the laws of Mashiach. That's the very, very, very last 2 chapters of this magnum opus of 14 volumes in which Maimonides codified all law. So we're actually towards the end of the last section because it's the laws of kings and their wars and the ultimate king, Mashiach. So at the end, there's 2 chapters talking about Mashiach. And the Rebbe points out, specifically in this concept of how there's an obligation to impact and help the world, the chapters end on a very different note. Again, you have to have the Rebbe's prism of eyes to see it, but the chapters end very differently. If we see the difference, I could try to find it in the original here because I'm holding my Maimonides in my hand. At the end of chapter 11, it's chapters 11 and 12 in Maimonides' Laws of Kings. So at the end of chapter 11, it says that Mashiach, one of his jobs is, he's going to correct, he's going to rectify the entire world, that the entire world will serve God together. Now he's quoting the verse. Then I will turn onto the nations a clear language, that all will be able to call out in the name of God, and to serve God as one. Maimonides is saying that Mashiach is going to rectify the deeds, correct the deeds of all the nations of the world, to bring all the nations to serve God. And then Maimonides quotes a verse, which is actually in 2 different prophets. It's both in Tzfania and Isaiah, I believe, that then at that time of Mashiach, the entire world will serve God. So Mashiach is for the whole world. By Mashiach, the whole world is going to serve God, as there are many, many verses that bring out that concept. I told you, I remember teaching you once how Shema, that verse of Shema, Yisrael, Hashem, Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is Lord, the Lord is one. The Lord is one. Rashi, the most basic commentator, says, what does it mean the Lord is one? Because now just we serve the Lord. But when Mashiach comes, the whole world is going to serve the Lord. The Lord is going to be one. He's going to be accepted by all. So this is a foundational concept that by Mashiach, the whole world will serve God. But the Rebbe is pointing out the difference between chapter 11 and chapter 12. So in the end of chapter 11, we're saying Maimonides is saying that Mashiach is going to like work with the world, correct them, rectify them, bring them to serve God. In the end of chapter 12, it's a short chapter, but in the end of chapter 12, Maimonides says, at that time, there won't be any hunger, there won't be any war, there won't be any jealousy, there won't be any competition, because good will be so free-flowing, all of the delicacies will be like the dust of the earth, and then the entire involvement of the entire world will only be to know God. All of the junk is removed, all of the distractions, all of the pressures, all of the challenges. God removes them all so we can freely be focused on doing the only thing we really going to want to do. Know God, connect to God, serve God. So what's the difference? What's the subtle nuance of difference between the end of 11 and the end of 12? These are the two chapters of Maimonides talking about Mashiach. So the Rebbe says, the end of 11 is akin to the first stage of the Noahide, the coercion stage. Again, Maimonides is not saying Mashiach is going to put a gun to anyone's head and say, you must serve God or else. But a force, a pressure. Here's Mashiach coming, the whole world is changing, and everyone is going to have to be corrected and rectified their wrongs. And that's like the Gentile that chooses to serve God because there's a certain pressure on him. That's akin to Abraham fathering these nations to put his direct energy into these people that they are going to lead a certain life. But then there's a higher approach, the Noahide who's freely choosing to love God. The Noahide who we call Hasidei Umos Ha'olam, from the righteous of the world, because he wants a relationship with God from his own volition. So how can that be by Mashiach? In other words, like by Mashiach, how could the Noahide choose to freely serve God when, like, so to speak, there's no choice at that point? What's the choice? God's revealed to all. The evil is gone. You're choosing God, not because you're choosing to choose God, because what other choice is there? But Maimonides implies at the end of chapter 12 that no, there is a higher stage. When all the junk was taken away, all the evil is gone, all the pressures are gone, no war, no competition, no jealousy, and you've got all the good, a person from their own heart is going to say, I want a relationship with God. I want to know God. Of course, I'm keeping the laws. I mean, I have no choice. I mean, the whole world has no choice. But I want to know God. I want to connect to God. I want to know God more deeply. I want to search and find and study about God. And that's the second level Noahide. That's the Hasidei Umos Ha'olam Noahide. That's like Sarah's energy, impacting the world in a more indirect fashion, that the godliness and the blessings and the sensitivity is flowing, which makes someone of their own heart decide, I want to be closer to God. Yeah, it's Mashiach. Yeah, nobody's serving any pagan idols. Yeah, all foreign fake stuff is out the window. Of course, we're all doing the right, but I just don't want to do it. I want to know God. I want to be close to God. So implying that even in the times of Mashiach, there's the element of Hasidei Umos Ha'olam, of people that are choosing, even in that backdrop, to say, I want to become close to God. So I just thought it was an amazing concept here of, again, I'm going to sort of sketch it out again because I threw a lot of information at you. I hope it was clear. We have Abraham and Sara, which is paralleling forcing the world to serve God the world choosing to serve God, parallel to the Noahide who serves God because, for example, he wants to live in Israel and doesn't want to get killed. The Noahide who's freely saying he's one of the righteous Gentiles of the world, Hasidim V'Sa'olam, he wants this relationship to God. Parallel to in the times of Mashiach, when at the end of chapter 11, the world will be corrected and rectified and everyone will do the good, to the end of chapter 12, when the world will say the only thing we're interested in is God. We want to know God. We want to study God. We want to connect to God. We want a deeper relationship with God. We want to be from the Hasidim V'Sa'olam. So that's how the Rebbe explains this energy of both for Abraham and Sarah, why with the birth of Isaac, their names changed, their identities changed. Their names and identities became even more outward bound than they were before, when they were always outward bound, but even more outward bound, to have more ability to impact the world, because you can't view the Jewish people in a vacuum. That's the point the Rebbe is saying here. I don't know if it's clear, but when I learned it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to share this with you. You can't view it like there's the Jewish people and then there's the world. No, the identity of the Jewish people and the identity of the world is so interwoven here, because together we have to serve God. Together we have to bring the world to God. And that's why, of course, as Isaac, the next link in creating the Jewish people, comes into this world, of course, Abraham and Sarah's energies shift and become more outward bound and have more ability to impact the world. So everything comes together to bring the world to God. So that was a talk of Lubavitcher Rebbe. Again, it was from the winter, meaning the end of 84 and 1982. I thought it was really, really, really profound in its vision of the Noahide and the Jew and the interwoven dynamics of giving God his world. Any questions? Let's see, actually someone just in the chat.
I have one. Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so you keep saying this phrase, Hasidei something olam, and I can't get that middle word. Can you just spell it out for me?
Sure. Hasidei umos. I should spell it in English or Hebrew? English?
Just spell it in English, sure.
O-O-M-O-S. Ooh, like
okay.
ooh, and then M-O-S, mos. Umos means the nations. Hasidei means the righteous.
Right.
Umos means the nations. Ha'olam means of the world. So the righteous of the nations of the world.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful title for beautiful people. Any other questions or thoughts on that? Or any way it shifts your understanding of your role in God's plan? Because to me, I thought that was really profound in terms of how the Rebbe is looking at your role in God's plan. Like, that's to me why I was like, wow, this is so special, because it's so highlighting the Noahide as, to me, it was just such a powerful message, because of course I'm sensitive to the issue because of the class, but I felt like, look at what the Rebbe is saying. The birth of Isaac automatically, of course, has to create a much more intense impact on the world, because these two things work together. It's not the Jewish people and then there's the world, and yeah, maybe some of the world is going to choose to serve God, and that's nice too, of course. No, it's like this interwoven dynamic of God expressing himself in this world and God wanting the world to come to him. And therefore, if you're going to bring me a Jewish people, you've got to bring me the nations, which of course goes back to what the Rebbe was saying, how when God gave the Torah in 2448, 2,500 some years after creation, what were the Jews commanded? To bring the world to serve God. Because again, it's not separate, like, okay, now I have my Jewish people. No, it's all part of, there's a world that is God's children. There's a world of people that God wants to connect to him. And therefore, of course, the birth of Isaac has to heighten the world's coming close to God. So I thought that was very, very, very special. Any other thoughts or questions on any of that? Dixie, if you're talking, I can't hear you. You have to on the bottom of your screen. Now I hear you.
Got it. I was just trying to figure out how to do it. Anyway, that's amazing. That is the first I've heard of that angle, and that really makes how do I want to say it? You know, we've been told such a separation between the Jewish and the non-Jews, and this is actually such a relief, I guess I want to say, to hear this from you.
Yeah, I thought it was very embracing. That's how I took it also, that it was very embracing.
Yeah.
As we see
Yeah,
in the other talks,
totally.
thing we see in
Totally.
the other talks of the Rebbe that we learned. I don't know if you remember, we learned 2 other talks previously where the Rebbe was really highlighting Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes as Noachides. We learned 2 talks, one discussing Jacob marrying sisters, and one discussing how Shimon and Levi, Simon and Levi were able to kill out the people of Shechem. It was a while ago, and both of them we were highlighting that their identity was Noachides. And also, to me, those talks were very like, wow, like we're really looking at our ancestors and understanding they were Noachides. So again, really bringing out that concept of this melding of the energies here of the Jews serving God, of the Noachides serving God. And ultimately, of course, this is God's will, that the world is to serve him. And we're all in it together, and we're all helping each other come closer and closer and closer to God. And that's what I felt very strongly from the talk. I really was amazed by it. Very special. Very, very, very powerful point. Anyone else? Anyone else have something to share? Something to add?
I just have one more question. That book that you have, Maimonides, is it in English by any chance?
Absolutely. It's a very famous book.
Okay.
It's called, it has 2 names. Its official name is Mishneh, Mishhneh, probably, and then Torah, Torah, or Tora, probably Torah, Torah. Mishneh Torah, Maimonides, of course, I'm sure you've all heard of Maimonides and his stature. When he was in the world some 850 years ago, it was hard for the regular Jew to know how to serve God because there's so many complex laws, and they didn't have, if you've heard today of Shulchan Aruch or something like that, that didn't exist yet. They had like the Talmud, and they're looking at a Talmud and trying to understand how to serve God. It's very complex. So Maimonides said, I'm making a user-friendly edition. And what he did was he went through the entire Talmud and he culled it of all the laws. And then he organized all the laws in a completely different way than the Talmud did. He made it logical and organized. Like, let's say we're talking about Sabbath. So he culled all the laws of Sabbath and said, here are all the laws of Sabbath. In the Talmud, if you want to know all the laws of Sabbath, of course, there's a Talmud tractate that talks about Sabbath. But there's also like another 6 places in the Talmud that discusses Sabbath. That's like how the Talmud works. It's a very free-flowing discussion. So we jump from topic to topic to topic, which is very fascinating if you're learning it. But if you practically want to know, like, am I allowed to do this on the Sabbath or not, you don't want to open up 12 different Talmud tractates to figure it out. So in the time of Maimonides, he was not the only one. There were 3 great, great, great sages, of which the most famous 2 is Maimonides, but there are 2 other great sages as well, that all 3 of them independently said, we got to make this more user-friendly. And each one did it in their own way. But what was unique to Maimonides was completely, if you will, chucking out the whole system of the Talmud, that division, and saying, that's great for scholarly study, but we want to make this user-friendly. So he culled all the laws. Imagine doing this on a computer. And then he systematically organized it into tractates. Unbelievable mind and ability and clarity and precision. It blows my mind. And he then created 14 volumes. All of Torah's laws in 14 volumes. And every volume has sections and chapters and laws. Very, very, very organized, very systematic, very like easy to learn, relatively speaking. And he writes in the introduction to this whole magnum opus, that's why he called it Mishneh Torah. What Mishneh Torah means is second to the Torah. Because he's saying, guys, you're good. Have a Tanakh, the scriptures. Have my book. You're good to go. You know exactly how to serve God. I took everything and put it for you. Now, if this is one of the books. There's again. This is the way it's printed here. This is one of 5 volumes. I have many sets of Maimonides in my house. Don't ask. So there's.
You can tell that you've read it a lot too.
Sets like this, sets like this, sets like this. There's lots of commentary on it. But and it's definitely out there in many languages. This is like very fundamental work, which some people study. In Chabad, we study it daily. There's a cycle of studying 3 chapters a day. So every year you finish all 14 volumes. If that's a bit intense for people, there's a cycle of studying 1 chapter a day, and it takes you 3 years to finish it. So let's say my husband has relearned these laws again and again and again since the 80s. Every year finishing the entire thing. So because this is like containing everything in a very, very, very organized fashion. What's also unique to Maimonides is incorporating the Noachites as much as he does. Because he really brings in the laws of as we're seeing, what we're studying, him bringing the Noachites. And what's also unique to Maimonides, which of course goes hand in hand with the Noachites, is bringing in the laws of Mashiach. Now, there's many other codifiers that they don't bring in the laws of Mashiach. It's like that's not part of what we're doing is the Band-Aid for exile. When Mashiach comes, you won't need my book anyway, so I'm not bothering. And Maimonides exclusively, he's the only codifier that does it. He brings in the last 2 chapters of this magnum opus, the culmination and conclusion is left learn about Mashiach. And when we're learning about Mashiach, what does Maimonides emphasize? That this is the whole world. Mashiach is the whole world serving God. It's not the Jewish people, both in chapter 11 and in chapter 12, as we just looked inside and read and translated, is the world is going to be serving God. That's part of the identity of Mashiach, and part of the definition of the era of Mashiach, and that there's a world, and the entire world is going to be serving God. So there's going to be a lot of people you're going to need to teach. There's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to be saying, wait, how do I do it fast? No, I don't have 5 minutes. I want a 5-minute course. Just fast. And then I want to know everything you've learned and studied in all these years. I'll give you 6 minutes. Just tell it to me really fast. And then there'll be all your friends that will say the opposite. They'll say, I don't get you. Why didn't you tell me? You were sitting there racking in all your brownie points and creating this whole relationship with God, and you knew Mashiach was coming, and then here we are out in the cold. Like, I thought you cared about me. And you're going to say, are we rewriting history? Do you know how many times I tried talking to you? And they'll be like, no, it didn't really happen. If you really cared, you would have pushed harder. You would have gotten me to see the truth. You didn't really bring me in. And of course, that's my fear also, that my friends will tell me that also. Because in a sense, that is sort of like, that is what people are going to feel. They'll forget all the times we tried, and they'll just know the bottom line, that they never heard us, or they thought they never heard us, or they rejected the message, and they'll be like, hey, why don't you tell me? So the only thing we can do to that is try even harder with our friends and our family and everybody that we have a relationship with, and just try to give them an awareness of God and the ability to serve him. Because as we're seeing from all these sources, for a Noahide, it is, in a sense, much more transformative than for a Jew. A Jew is a Jew. But if the Noahide is going to be a Noahide, or if he's going to be one of the righteous of the world, it completely changes everything in their life and their afterlife. And every part of their relationship to God is completely different. If this is a person who's freely choosing to serve God, a person who's saying, God, I want you. I want a relationship with you. I want to know you. I want to be in your space. And I know I'm doing that when I study and practice your work. So that's just a great general push for all of us to inspire our guilty conscience and work even harder, because I'm sure we're all working but work even harder to really try to help anyone we know come closer to God.
Amen.
Amen. Have a wonderful week. We will continue next week with Maimonides. I brought him here. I wasn't sure how long this talk would take us, but I did feel it was very, very powerful. Like Dixie said, I felt also it was very opening up in a very beautiful way of this relationship and interwoven connection that I was very, very moved by it, and I wanted to share it with everyone. I wish you have a wonderful week and a lot of inspiration by recognizing how precious we are to God and how God so much wants our service, so much wants our relationship. And that should just help us inspire to do a bit more, because sometimes I think this for myself, if I knew how much God really appreciated, I would probably push to do more. Now, of course, I say I'm doing everything possible and I'm completely maxed out. But if I really got how much it was valuable to God, I would find the space to do more deeply, to do more, to reach more, to touch more, to add more, and just to keep it how much God appreciates and loves and treasures every one of us, and how he so much wants, and how you represent billions of people, right? There's 8 billion mankind out there. How many are Noachides? Every one of you has to pull up so many people with your energy. So how incredibly, incredibly precious you are to God. Okay. Have a wonderful week. And just keep, we can't be burdened.
Thank you so much.
Just try to move even higher and closer and do more and more and more, recognizing we are really making Mashiach happen. Boy, does this world need it. We are really making Mashiach happen. Be well. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
Bye.
Thank you.
Sarah.
So much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.